As an introduction to Masechet Shekalim, I have here in the Mesifta a few paragraphs, some of which are less relevant to us, but some of them are important to mention. There's a mitzvah min Torah that every Ish Yisrael should be mafrish a machzis hashekel on an annual basis, and this is based on Parshas Kitisa in Shmos Perik Lamed, and it applies to both an ani and an oshir, and applies to a person whether he's in Eretz Yisrael or he's in Chutz La'aretz, and he delivers a machzis hashekel into the hands of the Gizbar of Hegdesh, who's appointed to receive this money. And if you open up to Shmos Perik Lamed, you'll have a unit of about 6 psukim, beginning with Pasuk Yud Aleph, Ki tisas rosh b'nei Yisrael, v'nosnu ish kofer nafsho, etc., etc., machzis hashekel b'shekel hakodesh. And when we say that this mitzvah is an annual mitzvah, how do you know such a thing? It seems that it might be just l'shah, just for that moment when they were counting the people of Israel. It was part of a census. Chazal are going to darshan, and it's one of the things that we're going to learn about, that this is not just a mitzvah to count the people, but it's a mitzvah for all generations, lidoros, to collect the funds for the running and the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash. And even if we don't have a census, and we don't have to count the Masechet Shekel to determine the number of people in Israel, nevertheless, there's still Kocha Yofa, the mitzvah still applies, as long as the Beis Hamikdash is up and running, in order to keep the Trumas Halishka, the money was put into a collection, into a safekeeping, and from there they would draw the monies to buy the Tmidim on a daily basis, the Musafim and all the other Karbanos Tzibur were taken from that money. Bisman said we don't have this mitzvah. Again, there may be a Zecher le-Machzas Shekel, but the real mitzvah of being mafresh a Machzas Shekel for the purpose of Karbanos obviously doesn't apply today. We don't have the Beis Hamikdash. He mentions an interesting machlokas Rishonim about whether you make a bracha on this mitzvah of hafrashas machzis hashekel, and it would seem that most Rishonim would say, "Why not? Let's make a bracha." But the Rashba in a tshuva writes that we don't make a bracha on this mitzvah, and the reason for that is because ein hatorem nosein klum mishalo. He gives some sort of philosophical explanation al pi hashkafa that this is not considered giving from your own pocket. And why is that? Because there's a pasuk in Divrei Hayomim that says, Ki mimcha hakol, that everything belongs to you, O God, umiyodcha nasno lach. We're giving it from your yad. It's your ownership. However, some claim that even the Rashba would agree that you do make a bracha, albeit not at the time of hafrasha, when you designate the money as money that belongs to Hegdesh, because that's not from your own, but at the time that you deliver the money to the Gizbar, that's called Chas Nesina, we make a bracha, not a shekin shonim, it's also al hafrashas machzis hashekel, like the other Rishonim, but according to the Rashba, shekin shonim, it's also v'tzivanu lases machzis hashekel, on the Nesina. Now, exactly how much is a shekel, which is a matbeah shel Torah, in Chazal it's called a selah, and a selah is the equivalent of 4 dinrim. So machzas shekel on a doraisa level will be the equivalent of 2 dinrim. And apparently during this Masechta, which as you know is Yerushalmi, it's not Bavli, so we're going to have a lot of challenges with the language of the Gemara. Of course, we're not familiar with the syntax of words. You'll see already in the first Amud that the word mar doesn't mean Mr., but it means Omar, and they drop the Aleph. And that's just one example of many, but we'll see if we can get used to these changes. In any event, the Gemara always uses the word shekel, even though the real meaning of the word is machzis hashekel. So don't get nervous if you see in our sugyas that we're learning about a shekel or shkolim. It means machzis hashekel, but the Gemara uses the term shekel. Now, the Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, in Parshas Kitisa, tries to give an explanation as to why in Chazal the word shekel appears and not machzis hashekel. And he says that that was the way it was used colloquial by the people. They took a half a selah and they gave it the name shekel, and a half a selah is a machzis hashekel, but they called it a shekel. And therefore the Lashon Chachamim in the Mishnah and so forth was borrowed from the use of the term as we know it on the street. We call it a shekel because a shekel is a machzis hasela. Half of a selah is called a shekel. There are 2 shkolim in a selah. And what we call chatzoi selah is really the machzis shekel, but it's called the shekel. So a chatzi selah is a shekel because in the time of the Gemara, when they would buy a selah, they would pay 2 shkolim for a selah. So half of a selah is a machzis hashekel, but it was called a shekel. Okay, now the Torah says that you have to give a machzis hashekel, not more than a machzis shekel and not less than a machzis hashekel. And the Mishnah is going to tell us about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah when the Olei Bavel came up to establish the second Commonwealth. And they actually divvied out something called a darkon. I guess we'd call it a passport. And that was a kind of a matbea. It wasn't really a matbea, but it was something that you could actually use in the market, and people would take it, and they would receive it, and it was considered like 2 sloim. And if they took half of that, which would be a selah, that would be the equivalent of a machzis hashekel, which they would contribute for the machzis hashekel. Now, in this introduction, he has a whole discussion about who's obligated in the mitzvah of machzis hashekel. Certainly, any male member of Klal Yisrael who's 20 years and up is chayiv machzis hashekel. And not only that, if he doesn't come up with the money, then the halacha is that bezdin mimashkin, so they'll take actually a collateral. Those who are potter from machzis shekel include noshim and avodim. However, if they decide on their own, which means voluntarily to contribute, then makabla mehem, we will accept their machzis hashekel, and it's given over to the tzibur. However, with regard to nachrim and kusim, even if they decide to volunteer for the machzis shekel, we don't accept it from them. What about a katan? If he hasn't yet reached simone bagrus, he's not obligated to machzis shekel. We're not going to demand of him that he should give machzis shekel, and certainly we're not going to confiscate any of his possession. Ein memashkin also. Once he brings simone bagrus from the age of 13 up to the age of 20, then midrabanan is chayav to give machzis shekel. And the halacha is that it's only a kind of preparatory stage of a chinuch, and therefore we don't go as far as being mamashkin, so we won't take his collateral if he hasn't come forward to contribute his machzis shekel. However, once he reaches the age of 20, then he's chayav min Torah, and if he doesn't come up with the money, bezdin mamashkin, so we will actually confiscate his possessions. Now, once the son has reached the age of chinuch, his father begins to give the shekel, the Masechet shekel on his behalf, on behalf of the katan. And the halach is that once the father has begun chinuch, whatever age he chooses, and there are guidelines, he cannot rescind. He's got to continue. As far as Kohanim and Leviim are concerned, there's a major machlokes where they're chayiv in the mitzvah of Masechet shekel. And even if you assume they are chayiv in the mitzvah of Masechet shekel, then we aren't memashkin osam. We don't confiscate their property in lieu of this obligation. And this is another subject that Emir Hashem will talk about. As you know, yesterday we read the parsha of Shekalim, and the reason is that we're going to learn about Mashmiyam al Shekalim, that already in advance we notify the people so that they prepare their shekel, their Masechet shekel for that period of time. And we train the Jewish people to already fulfill that obligation in advance. And that became a minhag that was accepted all the way back to the time of Nevi'im, this idea of being machriz al ashkolim, which we'll see here in the first Mishnah. And it's a matter of being mizares klal Yisrael, even though we will fulfill our obligation, but to give it an extra push. And that's going to begin on the first day of Adar, when the Shluchei Bezdin went out to make the declaration, Achroza, to already fulfill your mitzvah of shekel, bring your shkolim. And the reason why the first of Adar was designated for this Achroza, which is 30 days before they actually have to give the shekel has to be received no later than Rosh Chodesh Nisan, but we're going to give the tzibur an extra advance month and notify them to be mezaris them, so that by Rosh Chodesh Nisan we've collected all the shkolim. And we might add that these shkolim from Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we begin with the new shkolim of this year to buy the korbanos tzibur. We're going to have many complicated diunim about what happens with last year's shkolim if there's leftover. But fundamentally, every year requires using the New Year's shkolim for the korbanos tzibur, and the new year for shkolim is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, this achraza, in the cases of far-flung places that were makomos rechokim, would take place even earlier than Rosh Chodesh Adar, in the Tchilas HaChoref, at the beginning of the winter. And the actual collection of the Masechet shekel took place no later than the 15th of Adar, which is actually Purim. That's going to be the first sugya. I mean, when I say Purim, I mean mukafos. You know, the walled cities would celebrate Purim on the 15th, and on that very day, they collected the Masechet shekel. And the Gemara is going to discuss that right here at the beginning. Now, on the 25th of Adar, the money changers in Yerushalayim would sit publicly, and that would be a way in which those who hadn't brought their shkolim by the 25th of Adar would be encouraged to do so. The money changers are there. If you don't have a Masechet shekel, go and he will change the money for you. On that same day, the 25th of Adar, the Gaboyim, the Gizbar of the Migdash, would send out shluchim, special, shall we call them Gaboyim, that would be mamashkin. They would go from house to house. They had a list of those who did not contribute. It's already the 25th of Adar. If by this time they haven't contributed, they're going to start knocking on doors and taking a mashka. Okay, there's something called the Trumas Halishka, which was a great kuppah and there was more than one. There was a whole bunch of them, and we'll see exactly how each one functioned. And into those kupot, the gizbarim would put the machzis hashekel. Now, there's a machlokas rishonim that we should mention here in our introduction about exactly how this Trumas Halishka took place. He says that in our commentary on this Masechta, we will assume the Shita, which is the Rambam Shita, that there were two types of kupos into which the shkolim were placed. And we're going to talk about the different usages, respectively, of each one of these two kupos. And according to the Rambam, at the end of the month of Adar, the Gizbar would go into a chamber, a lishka, and he would fill in, bags of shkolim that were collected in three different kupos, very large kupos. Each one of those kupos had the ability to have within it 9 se'in. And all the shkolim that were placed in these three great gigantic kupos, these receptacles, were called the Trumas Halishka. So this is one category of kupos for the shkolim. And that's going to be the category that we're most focused on, which is called the Trumas Halishka. There was another kupa that was called Shiare Halishka. And they used the Shiare Halishka for surplus shkolim in certain circumstances. Okay, fine. This is more or less what we want to start with. We'll finish up this Hakdama tomorrow. Let's not delay any further. We'll start Masechet Shekalim now with the mitzvah saseh that was noeg at the time of the Beis Hamikdash to contribute a machzis hashekel on an annual basis for the purpose of the Karbanas HaTzibur. And on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, as we said before, they began bringing the Karbanas HaTzibur from the new shkolim that were contributed during the past month from Rosh Chodesh Adar until Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And again, as we said before, the shkolim were collected into a certain specific chamber in the Beis Hamikdash. On Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they would fill up 3 kupos from the shkolim, and those were called the Trumas Halishka. From the shkolim in these kupos, they would purchase karbonos tzibur. So the Mishnah says the following: Bi'achad ba'adar mashmiim al hashkolim. The shluchim of Bezdin would go out on the first of Adar. We'll see which Adar it is in the case of a Shana Muberes, and they would make a hachraza. Mashmiya means machrizin. They would announce in all the cities of Israel that it's time for Klal Yisrael to bring the Masechet Shekel for the purpose of Karbanas Tzibur, so that would guarantee that by the time we got to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, it would be possible to begin to bring the karbonos from the Truma Chadasha of this year. And they would make another achroza because already at this time of the year, there was a problem with Kilayim. They were planting their fields. It was at the end of the winter, the beginning of the spring. And if there was anything growing in the fields that would be Kilayim, let's say Tvua, that was grown in close proximity to Yayin, to Geffen, then they would have to be oker, they would have to uproot that combination, that kilayim, and this was the time of the year when they did so. Now the Gemara at the end of the Masechta Megillah says the following, that Bishleim ala kilayim, we understand why Mashmir Bi'echad Bi'adar and Kilayim Bizman Zriyah. that at the end of the winter is the beginning of the planting season. And they have to know that there are laws that regulate planting. You can't just plant, according to your will. Now, Tosfos in Masechet Megillah says we shouldn't take the Gemara literally, that on Aleph Adar they started planting. The Gemara Bava Metzia says that the Zriya was at a different time. What the Gemara means about Echad Ba'adar, it means the end of the Zriya period. And the Tvuos and the Zroim are already growing, and that's where they can see where there's Kalayim. So it wasn't a warning in advance, says Tosfos, of be careful where you're planting what. They had already long ago planted. But that which grew from the planting of months ago was now on Rosh Chodesh Adar was Nikar. You could see it. And now you can see where there are Zroim and where there are Geffen and so forth and so on. And you have to be Oker, make sure to take out that which is Kilayim. So there are two understandings of this mission about Kilayim. One understanding is that on Rosh Chodesh Adar, they warned them about the planting that's going to take place from Rosh Chodesh Adar and on. And Tosfos says, no, they were warning them to be Oker, that which was growing in the field and was Kilayim and had been planted earlier. The Mishnah continues, Ubechamisha Sarbo, on the 15th of Adar, which, as we said before, is Purim Demukafim, Orinix Amegillah B'Krachim, in the large cities that are surrounded by walls, we will read the Megillah. And on the same day, Bezdin would be careful about many different Sarchei Atzibur. It's so interesting that the overlap of Bezdin and their obligation vis-a-vis Tzarchei Tzibur and the reading of the Megillah in the Mukafos is on the same day, 15th. I don't know that this is coincidental, but it doesn't seem to be any connection unless the fact that all the Jews got together en masse in the large metropolis centers, that would facilitate the ability for Bezdin to find the people together and make the appropriate announcements. So first, Mesachnin es Hadrachim, and second, es Harachovos. Why were the Bezdin concerned about the Drachim and the Rechovos? And the answer is that this is at the end of the winter period. Imagine the 15th of Adar represents the termination of winter. And at that point, a lot of the public thoroughfares and highways were somewhat ruined because the heavy rains would create, I guess, crevices in the ground. And we know even today, we need all these companies, and the government has to take care of fixing the roads. I remember in my youth in America, after the winter, there were potholes that had to be filled in, had to be taken care of. They were very dangerous. And this is something that, as the representatives of Tzarchei Tzibur, the Bezdin becomes responsible and obligated to make sure that this is done. The Es Mikvos Hamayim. This was the date in the Hebrew calendar year when Bezdin would take care of the mikvos that were used for Tara, that were used for Tefillah, because the mikvos were very often under the sky, and as a result of the rains, there was water that washed cement and refuse, all sorts of soil and gravel into the mikvah, and the mikvahs had to be cleaned. this was the date at the end of the winter when it was time to clean the mikvot, shape them up. And clean out all the tit, the refes that resulted and accumulated from the Yomim HaGshamim, from the rainy season. And Rashi elsewhere adds another element here, that the kashrus of the mikvos had to be guaranteed. And in many cases, the mikvos became disqualified. And the Beis Din was called upon to supervise the re-establishment of the kashrus of the mikvos. Okay, what else? The Mishnah continues. The osin called tzarchei rabim. What is the Mishnah including here with called tzarchei rabim? He's only taking care of all the, damages that were caused by the winter. What else is included here in tzarchei rabim? He writes here that for this we'd have to see the Gemara on Daf Gimel that is going to enumerate all the tzarchei rabim. But he adds that there's a chiddush in this entire Mishnah that on the very day of the Yontiv of Purim, people are preoccupied with Purim. On that very day, all these malachas that we're involved in are permissible. And I'm thinking out loud here that maybe what's going on is that our minig is to abstain from malach on Purim. I mean, on a Doraisa level, obviously there is no Isa malach on Purim. But when there are Banan through minog, they established an Isa malach on Purim because it's Meseach Das Min HaSimcha. They did not do so with regard to tzarchei rabim. Now, the next part of the Mishnah is about the Kohen. Umetzainin es hakvaros. If you're familiar with the phrase tziyun kever. Now, the original minog of tziyun kever was, as we see here in our Mishnah, to protect the Kohanim, so that they should know where the kvarim are located, because they're enjoined from being matami themselves to a kever. But eventually the minog evolved way beyond that. And it was not just to make a sign for the Kohanim and notify them where the kvarim are, but it enhanced the kavod hames. Because what does it mean, mitzainin es hakvaros? Ofchim sid. Sid in English, I think, is lime, perhaps, plaster. Shofchim sid, svivos hakever. Imagine this whole clump of plaster that look like this and that. In other words, it looked like the kever. Simon lekohanim v'osei tarashi yoloyali yahilu al kever v'yitmo. This was the way of notifying the Kohanim that they shouldn't come near here, because if they walk over the kever, that's called mahil al hames, and then the Kohen will have contracted tumah. And I believe that this is the basis of our matzeva. Today we have matzeva. The matzeva is itself a simon l'kohanim shelo yitamu, but it took on a whole new meaning, and that is kavod shel mes. Now, why was it necessary l'tzayin es hakvaros on an annual basis? Why not do it once and that's enough forever? But the answer is the Amos Hagshamim haya hasid nimoach, that sid, that plaster that they put around the kever would get dissolved by the rains. The yotzim af al hakilayim. Now, I'm not sure how to translate the word yotzim. I think the word yotzim, but again, I have a question on what I'm saying, is a reference to the shlichei bezdin, because at the beginning of this mission it says mashmiim, but it doesn't say yotzim. So perhaps mashmiim means, in a general sense, that they have to notify the people not only about the shkalim but also about the kilayim. But the Mishnah ends with the word yotzim, and that means that even after the first wave of shlichim went out to notify the people to be careful about kilayim or to be oker the kilayim, and these were representatives of the Batei Dinim, there'd be a second wave of yotzim meaning of shluchei bezdin, to go out, not to be mashmiya, but ala kalayim livdok. Livdok means to make sure that they did what they had to do, that the owners of the fields removed that which is kalayim. And that would mean either that they would make sure that the planting was done properly, or if the planting had taken place already long before, to make sure that they were out oker any kalayim, that they uprooted the kalayim. Let me just take a look here if I have the English translation just to see if he adds anything. You know, from the little experience which started yesterday on Shabbos in Masechet Shekalim, I see that just to translate the words is not such a simple matter. Let's see if he adds anything here. Okay, he says a krach is a city that's surrounded by a wall, as opposed to an ear. An ear is any city, whether it's walled or not walled. And he goes through an explanation as to why they commemorate Purim in the walled cities on the 15th. That's a long discussion here. That's more from Masechet Megillah. And public thoroughfares or streets, which are streets behind the houses, that's where people, children, they use that area. Now, the rains of the winter severely damaged these public thoroughfares and these streets. It was necessary to repair them for the Ole Regel. So that I didn't see. He's got a sefer on Masechet Shekalim called Tiklin Chadatin. Tiklin are Shekalim in Aramaic, Chadatin are new. I don't know if we can get access to that sefer, but in any event, in that sefer, he tells you that this whole business about, you have it?
I have it as an explanation on the Gemara page. I have Tiklin Chadatin.
Oh, so they added it to the page. Let me just see. I want to check out for a second, if you don't mind. In the back of the Masifta, they have a bunch of commentaries. Maybe they have this one. Tiklin Chadatin. All right, I don't see it offhand, but it might be here. Oh yeah, here it is. Tiklin Chadatin. Let me just see then if I can find it on our Mishnah, so we can read it from the original. That's always a preferable. Second. Okay, here it is. He says, "Metachnis hadrachim sheniskalkalu b'yimotz hageshavim, metachnin osan b'shvil ole regolim." Just exactly what we saw in the English translation. That's what it appears here. Or inami. Now he offers a second possibility as to why we have to fix up these public thoroughfares after the winter did its damage. B'shvil hagolim li'orei miklat. K'dichsiv tachin lecha haderech. So the Torah has, and the Perek in Makkas, we learned it together. You may remember that has all sorts of requirements of setting up signs and different ways that we can guarantee that the Rotzeach B'Shogeg can get to the Miklat as soon as possible before the Rotzeach knocks his block off. Because after all, we assume, I mean, we don't know yet, the Bezdin is going to have to decide this, but he's an unintentional murderer. So he doesn't really deserve to die, but the Torah allows the Gol Adam to kill him. So we have to facilitate Tachin L'cha Derech. And one of the ways that Bezdin, as representatives of the Tzibur, are going to have to do this is by fixing up the public thoroughfares as of the end of the winter. Just see if he adds anything else here. The rain, you have to inspect the roads before the festivals of Shavuos and Sukkot. However, because rain during the summer in Eretz Yisrael is extremely rare, he says that the reason why we are doing, according to the Tikkun Chadatin, we are doing this Tikkun before the holiday of Pesach. What about the other two holidays? If you're talking about Ole Regel, it should apply 3 times during the year. He says, because there's no vast amount of rain that falls before Shavuos or before Sukkot, so that we should be worried about, the roads having been damaged. But before Pesach, when we have the 6 months of Yemos HaGeshamim, that's when we have, from Sukkot to Pesach, the greatest damage to these public thoroughfares. He has another pirush, but he doesn't tell you who said it, that there's a general obligation incumbent upon Bezdin to keep the roads of Eretz Yisrael in good repair, which means it fits under the Takanas Ezra of Tikkun Eretz Yisrael, that Eretz Yisrael has to be in tip-top shape. Oh, he goes on to discuss the Ari Miklat. Now he says about mikvos that there was an accumulation of rainwater in ditches, and they were dedicated as mikvos, as ritual baths. But mud and other debris, that's a good word, debris, I didn't have that word, that fell into these mikvos during the rainy seasons are now cleaned out. Bezdin had to check the volume of the water in each mikvah to guarantee that it measured the required arboim sa. That's what he said, to give a hechsher on the mikvah. Graves were marked by lime. We said lime at one point, but then we said plaster. I don't know, we weren't sure exactly what sid is, whether it's lime or plaster. It was poured in the vicinity of the grave. And the Gemara says later on, it's going to go into great detail about how to do this. And lime was chosen for this purpose because of its whiteness. Now he adds that it's the color of bones, but I would say whiteness is the simon that there's a corpse here that's been buried. He says that some of these markers were obliterated during the winter rains, and it was necessary at this time to inspect the graves and replace missing markers so the Kohanim and those who handle Kodshim would be able to guarantee that they were in a state of ritual purity. And we had to notify the Kohanim that this is where they have to distance themselves from the grave. On the first of Adar, Beis Din warned everyone to eliminate all forbidden mixtures in their fields and their vineyards. So although it's Purim in Yerushalayim, nevertheless, these activities were permitted because Purim was accepted by the Jewish people to be a day of drinking and eating. It's not a day of work, but it's not a day where work malach is prohibited. In other words, the whole Isser of malach on Purim is all a matter of minhag, and included in that, excluded from that minhag, is anything that's necessary for the public, whether it's the thoroughfares, whether it's the kohanim, or whether it's the collection of the shekalim. Now, with regard to kilayim, he says that people had to be alerted to ascertain whether there was an admixture of seeds that had begun to sprout in the fields or the gardens. I would have said that this is Tosfos in Megillah, but in any event, he quotes it in the name of the Rambam. Now, the law is that if a foreign seed growing in a field constitutes 1/24 or more of the growth of the field, then the growth is considered kilayim. If kilayim is discovered in one's property, then the foreign growth must be reduced below the limit of 1/24. Now, I'm not sure what he means by foreign growth, but I think he means that which he plants second. That which he plants first, and no issue of kilayim. Then he adds a second planting, and he has to guarantee that it would not add a growth to the first planting of more than 1/24. The ratio of 1 to 24, however, does not need to be totally eliminated. In other words, you don't have to eliminate the kilayim, but you have to reduce the level of the foreign growth to less than 1/24, and then you can leave it there. You don't have to uproot that. So the ratio of 1 to 24 is the equivalent of a quarter kav per saw. All right, for that, you have to know a little bit more detail. All right, let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara asks the obvious question: what's special about Rosh Chodesh Adar that you want to be mashmiah al hashkalim? To guarantee that the Jewish people have enough of a time period, in this case 30 days from Rosh Chodesh Adar until Rosh Chodesh Nisan, to prepare, to designate, and to bring their shekalim to the Beis Hamikdash. V'ti tarem trumas al lishka, so that now we can guarantee that we have enough of a truma of shekalim, an accumulation of shekalim in the trumas al lishka min achadosha, from this year's new shekalim, bismana bi'echad b'Nisan, so that on the day of Rosh Chodesh Nisan they could bring the karbanos tzibur from the new shekalim. Now it says v'mar. Again, as I told you before, in the Yerushalmi, mar means Omar. The Omar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. The reason why Trumas HaLishka is on the 1st of Nisan, and from that day on, we bring the karbanos for the tzibur from the Shekalim Chadashim, from Rosh Chodesh Nisan and on. Why were they kovei the zman at that particular calendar, on that particular calendar date? Kischilasa. Why did they set up this date of Aleph Nisan as the beginning of the Truma? Dichsiv, because if we go back to the Hakomas HaMishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu, it says at the end of Sefer Shmos, Vayehi b'chodesh harishon b'shana shenis. So it's the second year since Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's the first month. We know that Achosh Zelochem Rosh Chodashim is reference to Nisan. It's Bi'echad Lachodesh Hukama Mishkan. The day of Hakamas HaMishkan was none other than Rosh Chodesh Nisan. V'tani Allah, and we have a brisa that says Bayom Shehukam HaMishkan Bo Bayom Nitrama Truma. On that very day of the beginning of the Mishkan, which was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they brought Karbanos Tzibur and they purchased them from Shekalim Chadoshim. And the Chachamim established a Zeichel Adav that on every year we should be Torem the Lishka on the first of Nisan. So again, the source, according to Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, for Trumas HaLishka on Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the fact that that was the day on which they erected the Mishkan. It was the first day in which the Mishkan was in operation. Before that, they had the Yimei HaMiluim, but the actual operation of the Mishkan began with Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And on that very day, they brought Karbanos Tzibur from the new Shkol. Now again, that doesn't really establish a mitzvah d'oraisa. You're telling me that that was in the midbar, the day that they started buying the Karbanos Tzibur, because that was the first day that they could possibly do so. It was the day of Hakamas HaMishkan. What does that have to do with me? What does that have to do with next year or the year after? You could have arbitrarily chosen any day as the beginning of the new year. But we're going to honor or commemorate the original Trumas HaLishka, meaning the day on the first round, in which they took the monies from the Trumas HaLishka to buy the Karbanos Tzibur, and we're going to commemorate that day. And that's the Takonos Chachamim, that every year, annually, we should be Torem the Lishka on the first of Nisan, just like they did it on the first year when Moshe was in the Midbar. And that's the Takonos Chachamim, which is called Zecher L'Dov. They made a Zecher L'Dov. Now the Gemara quotes Rav Tevi or Tavi in the name of Rav Yoshia, in the name of Rav Kahan. Now this might give us more of a doraisa. We're not talking about a zecher l'dava when we designate the first of Nisan for the buying of the karbonis from the new truma. But nemar kan chodshei v'nemar kan chodshei. So we have now a gzeira shava, chodshei chodshei. Now kan, the first occurrence of the word chodshei, actually it's not in the sequence of the psukim, it's actually the second, not the first. And that is the Karban Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. It says, Zos olas chodesh b'chodsho lichodshei hashana. So we have the word chodshei. And if we go back to Parshas Bo, it says, HaChodesh hazeh lochem rosh chodashim rishonu lochem lichodshei hashana. And that means for the month of Nisan, which is Rosh Chodesh. It's the Chodesh that is Rosh Chodashim. It's Rosh Chodashim, the first Chodesh of the year. But the Torah, in talking about Nisan as designated as the first month of the year, uses the word Chodshe, which is the same word that appears in the Karban Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. What does this mean? What are we going to derive from Chodshe Chodshe? Ma Chodshe shenever lahalon. Interesting that the Shalmi used the word lahalon. Because lalon means usually later on, but here it doesn't mean later on because we're going back to the pasuk in Sefer Shmos. Is ein monin ela Nisan, which is the first month of the calendar year, the Hebrew calendar. We think it's Tishrei. No, it's Nisan. And that's HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodesh. Is therefore, we take that Rosh Chodesh Nisan and we put it into the pasuk that uses the same word Chodshei with regard to the Karbonos Musaf, meaning the Olas Rosh Chodesh, the Musaf service of Rosh Chodesh, which requires a separate carbon. That doesn't, and it doesn't matter whether it's Shabbos or it's not Shabbos. Af Chodshei Shana, Chodshei Shenemar Kan, in the context of the Karban Musaf Rosh Chodesh, Ein Monin Ela Min Nisan. On the first of the month of Nisan, we're going to be Torim Es Halishka, we're going to bring the Karbanos Tzibur from the new Shkolim. I don't understand the word Monin. Monin, I guess here means that when you have a calendar and you want to know which is the first day that's relevant to whatever obligation you're dealing with, you use the word Monin. So the Monim here is a reference to the Trumas Halishka. And in this case, we say that on Echad B'Nisan, we're going to be Torim Es Halishka. And now we have a Doraisa, because as you and I know, Xeris Shava is Doraisa. So this halach that on Aleph Nisan, we begin to purchase Karbonos HaTzibur from the new Shkolim is Doraisa, according to Rav Tevi. Whereas according to Rav Mori, Rav Shmuel, it's a Darbana. And while it's true that the first day of Hakomas HaMishkan was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and that was the day in which they purchased Karbonos Tzibur, but that's not a basis for obligating us for all generations on an annual basis to be mafresh a Masechet Shekel and to begin purchasing the new Karbonos. I mean to say the Karbonos Tzibur from the new Shkolim on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The fact that that took place at the time of Moshe, that doesn't set it in stone for all time the Mikdash stands. So as we said before, that's already a Zeichel Adavar. But according to Rav Tevi, now we're not talking about a Zeichel Adavar, but we're talking about a Din Doraisa. Now, you know, the super commentary on the Yerushalmi is the Pnei Moshe. And he tries to explain why the Gemara rejects Rabbi Shmuel and offers a second possible source for deriving this halacha of Aleph ben Nisan for the Trumas Halishka. And he writes, it's a long piece. Let me just see if I can summarize it. He says, although it's true that the first Trumas Halishka was definitely at the time of Moshe on Aleph Nisan, but there was no Mishkan before Aleph Nisan. So who says that now that we have the Mishkan up and running, we shouldn't be taking from the new Shkolim for Karbonos HaTzibur on an earlier date? In the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was less brera. It was the Efshar. It couldn't have been earlier than that date because there was no Mishkan earlier than that date. V'loli acher, and there's no doubt that Moshe Rabbeinu could not begin this process at a later date. Became a shehukam mishnah hutzruku litro malishka lahavi karbanos tzibur shekarvu bo bayom. On that very day, they were karbanos tzibur, so they had to purchase them Where was the money coming from, if not from the Trumas Halishka? And therefore, the Gemara says we must find a drasha gemura min Torah, and that's going to be the second opinion, that of Rabbi Shmuel. That of Rabbi Tevi, that we're going to derive from Gzeirus Shava. Now he quotes the Torah Tmima. That's a surprise. Who writes that Enkan Machlokas. Interesting. Adorish Gzeirus Shava, who rak Mosif Smach v'chizuk l'tama rishon. Okay, I mean, that's not the way we understood it. We were saying that the Tama Rishon is only a Zeichel Adom, whereas the Tama Sheni is Dorais. Or Tmim insists that there's no Machlokas, and the Gzeirus Shava is just some sort of extra. He calls it Lahosif Smach. Maybe the Tartmim understood that this was not a technical Gzeirus Shava in the full sense of the term. Now, you could perhaps bring a little support to the Tartmima's approach that this is not a real Gzeirus Shava because of a question asked by the Shiarei Karbon, which I think we also have on this page. Do we not? All right, I'm not finding it right now. We have the Rivan, we have the Taklin Charitin, we got the Karbon Eda, we got the Mishnah Eliyahu. Wait a minute. Where's the Pnei Moshe? 1 second. I don't get it. Tell me there's no Pnei Moshe on the Yerushalmi Shekalim? You have a Pnei Moshe in your Gemara? I don't. Oh, here it is.
No.
Interesting. All the way in the back, he's got a third section. There are 3 sections here. I didn't notice. This is Mamich all the way in the back. And here he has the Pnei Moshe. So let's see if we can find Shiarei Karbon. I don't see Shiarei Karbon. I see Pnei Moshe. All right, so I don't know right now where this Shiarei Karbon is. Maybe it's just a separate section, sefer. I don't know. But he writes that if you look in the Rambam and Pirush HaMishnayos to explain what this Aleph Adar is all about, the Rambam only quotes Rav Shmuel, which is clearly a D'Rabbanan. He doesn't even bring Rav Kahana and Rav Tevi, who according to what we understood, was establishing it as a Doraisa. Why would the Rambam do such a thing? If you had a choice between explaining a Mishnah according to one Almora or according to another, you would certainly choose the one that says it's Doraisa. And the Rambam didn't do so. What would have motivated the Rambam? Unless we accept the Torah Tmima, that the second opinion is just coming to give a smach, but it's not a real technical Doraisa Gzeirus Shava. And this leads us to Omar Rabbi Yonah. I think we'll end here. Omar Rabbi Yonah, let's make a note of it. And our work for tomorrow will be to understand why the Gemara raises objections to Rabbi Tavi here from a Brisa. And another responsibility that I'm going to take upon myself, B'li is to try to find the Shiarei HaKarbon. Where is that sefer? And number 3 is to finish up our Hakdama. We're pretty much at the end, but maybe to add a little bit from this overview that he offers for Masechet Shekalim. Okay, then Rabbi said, we'll see how it goes. This is for me, this is a new shekel. Okay then.